part of an amphibious task force. We were over there at the end of 1990 through, I think we got back either late May or early June. And then shortly thereafter, went to a community college in San Diego. I stayed out in California. I was from Kansas, and then went to Cal State University San Marcos. Graduated, went to work as a stockbroker for 2 years, and got a commission. Went back into the Marine Corps, back out to the West Coast after getting commissioned and becoming an infantry officer, and then served as a infantry platoon commander before going over to force reconnaissance. I went from force recon platoon commander overseas for almost 3 years to instructor assignment as the reconnaissance instructor at the Marine Corps' version of Top Gun out in Yuma, Arizona, as the ground instructor that would call in airstrikes. Then went back to force recon right before the war in Iraq kicked off. Served there from 02 to 06. And then they stood up the Marine Special Operations Command as an active component of the U.S. Special Operations Command, which since 1987, the SEALs, Green Berets, Rangers, Air Force Special Operations had all had forces a part of. The Marine Corps had always looked at itself as an elite unit. They did not want to pay for forces that would be utilized by a joint force commander, which is exactly what happened to us. We were the very first special operations company to be activated, deployed. We got overseas and we worked for an Army colonel who was a Green Beret, and the Marine Corps had the wherewithal to understand ahead of time that that's likely what would have happened. Is they would have to man, train, and equip, and basically pay for the beer and watch somebody else drink it. They didn't want to do that, and so they fought that since 1987. Donald Rumsfeld, at the start of 9/11, gave the order for every service to contribute more special operations. The Marine Corps resisted again. They slow rolled it. They did a 2-year proof of concept called Marine Corps Special Operations Command Detachment 1 to slow roll, thinking that Bush 43 or Bush Jr. would become a one-term president like his father. He got reelected, kept Rumsfeld on. Rumsfeld then ordered the Marine Corps, hey, you're going to form a component, and that happened in late 2005. By surprise, the Marine Corps, like I said, was trying to slow roll this with this proof of concept, and all of a sudden, the Marine Corps was caught flat-footed, hey, you're going to do this, and they pulled me out of First Force Recon before one of our last deployments, or the last deployment to Iraq for First Force Recon Company. And we stood up, as a briefed, our very first Special Operations Company and deployed to Iraq. We thought we were going to deploy to Iraq. We deployed to Afghanistan. And that's kind of where a lot of this inter-service rivalry, as well as you had those in the Marine Corps that did not want this to occur, and so there was this infighting on various different sides. One of the jury members from what would later be the Court of Inquiry, it hadn't happened, a Marine Corps Court of Inquiry hadn't happened in over 50 years, but Lieutenant Colonel Steve Morgan termed this as a perfect storm of toxic officers, and he wasn't talking, as he clarified in many public presentations and congressional briefs, that this was Air Force, Marine, and Army officers. So, and that's not what Fred Galvin said. That's what the jury members, Lieutenant Colonel Steve Morgan, had said. So I wrote the book, A Few Bad Men, and you read the last half of the book. A lot of people are very shocked by it, but one thing you will find in the book is a lack of personal comments throughout the last half of the book. So it's a courtroom trial. It was the longest trial in Marine Corps history during the war in Afghanistan. And it was what people said in sworn testimony during this war crimes trial. That's, again, not what I said. It's what over 40 sworn witnesses brought into a courtroom, that what they said under oath. However, many of those that had information that they were kind of protected, they classified their conversation or their testimonies, and I fought for 11 years to get that declassified, and it is now declassified. So their courtroom testimony is in the book verbatim. A Few Bad Men. When you read that, you're like, how did he get away from this? He perjured himself. This person over here admitted that he was wrong, and then went on and wrote in a book later on that these guys still, got away with murder. These guys went on. One, Colonel John Nicholson, went on to become a 4-star Army general. And this happened multiple times and is very damning. So when this book is out there now, prior to it launching, beginning of this calendar year, had several cyber attacks against me. Just had let's call them they personified 2 accounts, one on LinkedIn, one on Twitter, used my name, pictures, said that I was going to be dying in 6 months, and were trying to pose as I was crazy, and so very slanderous, attacking me. And then somebody hacked into Facebook, sending out from my Facebook account malicious code that was messing up. As I was telling people this book's coming out, here's the link to pre-orders. Somebody definitely was against that, but nobody has publicly said a single word. And
Interesting. I'm sure your book threatens a lot of people in high up positions that
names are names. It literally doesn't hold anything back.
Wow. So can you tell us just a kind of a quick rundown of the actual ambush that happened that kind of led to all this?
Sure. A little bit of a backdrop. As most people, especially veterans that were in combat during this time, year 2007, we had all the U.S. Marines had been pulled out of Iraq had been pulled out of Afghanistan, surged into Iraq. There was a full-page ad taken out in the New York Times in 2007. Many of you remember this, called it was a hit ad against then Lieutenant General Petraeus. The ad was General Betrayus, and what they were saying, it's very much like what we're going to experience here after the midterms. Is 2007, they were gearing up for a general election, and it was very unpopular. Lots of Americans were being killed and wounded in the war in Iraq, and they surged over 100,000 forces into Iraq. It was very bloody and unpopular. So that was the focus of effort. Afghanistan, before that, was this success story, kind of an economy of force. We went over there, a lot of, primarily, but not entirely, but primarily a lot of Army Special Forces, a lot of Air Force, and they were really doing a great job of, really putting it to the Taliban. And then things changed. 2006, Hamid Karzai and President Bush met in the White House. They wanted to do this nation building. They agreed on this. Petraeus and Mattis agreed to joint Army and Marine Corps and all services, but Army and Marine Corps got together and decided on this counterinsurgency strategy, basically winning hearts and minds. Mattis even hijacked the Hippocratic Oath phrase of first do no harm that was injected into this war in Iraq and Afghanistan, and that really started the downward death spiral, in my words. And I know a lot of people say, you have Jocko out there quoting H.R. McMaster's and like, this counterinsurgency strategy. Counterinsurgency strategy works when people want a better government and a better life. It worked for the British in Argentina, but it had no chance of working in Afghanistan. There's no chance. These people didn't want a central government. They wanted Sharia law. They wanted tribal rule. The warlords didn't want to be displaced so it had no chance of working. We don't put people in the Pentagon with 3 and 4 stars on their collar. They're stupid. My assumption is they knew this wasn't going to work, but this was a way to turn something that was ridiculous into an opportunity and have this turn out to be a forever war. You look at Mattis, who's working for General Dynamics, getting paid $1 million on top of his $203,000 annual pension. He also works for Cohen Group, which he left that out of his Senate Armed Services Committee's confirmation hearing in January 2017 when he's testifying to become the Secretary of Defense. He worked for Cohen Group. This is the guy's former Secretary of Defense, Bill Cohen, who'd made many of these sweetheart deals with her good friends China. I'm saying that sarcastically. He's back to work for the Cohen Group, back to work for General Dynamics. But General Mattis was one of the feature stars in A Few Bad Men, this book that I wrote. He was the convening authority. He was somebody that has done something that no other general in the entire Marine Corps has ever done. And we were the 4th strike. So you had an event that happened in Fallujah in 2004 with 2nd Lieutenant Hilario Pantano from 2nd Battalion, 2nd Marines. That was the very first war crimes trial. And then you had the Haditha case, the Hamdaniya cases. So those 3 strikes, the Marine Corps stopped giving out hall passes, and they determined that ours, for whatever reason, we were going to get the wire brush. Mattis unleashed 45 criminal investigators, 4 prosecuting attorneys, 49 in total against 7 of us who were alleged falsely of mass murder, the largest count of alleged civilian deaths by machine gun in Afghanistan. They said we killed 19 and wounded 50 others, total of 69. They said on that morning of 4 March 2007, when we entered this village, which was right on the Afghanistan side of Afghanistan-Pakistan, they stated that that we came in. This is what the tribal elders stated, and this is what was repeated by my battalion commander the day he relieved me. He said, go ahead and relieve yourself. I didn't know if he was meaning I need to use the restroom. I thought somebody, the Marine Corps, as a commanding officer, battalion commander, have the guts, the courage to stand up there and do his job. But so, I stood up there and relieved myself in front of the command while he watched. Very cowardly act, but the fact of the matter is, right before then he said, was it true that you were drunk? So they believed the word of the Afghan locals in this. Again, I'll go back to, this is the first village on the Afghanistan side. So what was going on, there was this resurgence of Taliban activity as they fled Afghanistan into Pakistan after, the U.S. military routed them very effectively. Taliban fled. They had this training sanctuary. That's why Osama bin Laden was right out there in western Pakistan. So they had these massive training camps. They'd fully radicalized these foreign fighters in Pakistan, and then compliments of the United States government and taxpayers, they built the first paved road in Afghanistan. It connected the capitals. So instead of hiking over 14,000-foot snow-covered mountains in the most formidable terrain in the world, and they're in the Tora Bora Mountains, what was going on was they just give a little extra cash, some scratch to the border guard, and that's what they do in that type of place in the world. And all of a sudden, they have high-speed access. So
we essentially gave the Taliban a superhighway to operate, is what we did, right?
We gave them nirvana. We gave them the opportunity for them to mass export their poppy and opium, which was fueling the terrorism. And we were so stupid. So now they had this sanctuary that we said we won't go into in Pakistan, where that was just like a manufacturing center. Now I work at Tesla, so it's basically like you have the factory. You have a gigafactory over there, equivalent, in Pakistan, and then you have a distribution center right there on the Afghanistan side. So they're linking up with all their handler for that. Think of, when I say distribution center, like an Amazon fulfillment center. Yeah. These are the guys that are doing the last mile. So they link up with their handlers. And those handlers are taking them to Kabul, Kandahar, Sangin, Herat, everywhere to get their jihad on against the infidel. And we knew what was going on in that town. I'll just leave it at that. We knew exactly where 4 of these suicide bombers were that morning. We entered the town. We see everybody lined up. We'd pass through there in the morning. Normal pattern of life. We had men, women, and children in the market bazaar doing their thing. Come back 3 hours later, complete baseline change. Everybody in the patrol, very sensitive, because now we just see mass exodus, complete absence of women and children.
So you probably just felt something was wrong at that point, right? Like
We're
something.
going to get attacked.
Yeah.
Yes. And both sides of the road lined up, fighting age men. All of a sudden, a car bomb, a van filled with fuel and mortar rounds detonates right in front of our second vehicle. Then we start getting fire from a sports utility vehicle, Toyota Prado, on the south side of the road. This is coming at us high speed to T-bone the second vehicle that just got hit with the car bomb. And this was our ambulance. So it appears, of the 6 vehicles, it was the only one that had an open air compartment in the back to load passengers. So it visually looked different. This was 9 o'clock in the morning. Enemy at this stage in the game, we've been fighting in Afghanistan since 2001. This is 2007. They're not stupid. They targeted a thinner skinned vehicle, the only one that was not completely enclosed. They attacked that vehicle with a car bomb. They attacked that vehicle subsequently, immediately afterwards, with the sports utility vehicle. 3 jihadists hanging out of the windows, firing AK-47s, fully automatic. The turret gunner in that vehicle stood up. He was still on fire from the blast from the car bomb. That at that time, the explosive devices evolved from just shrapnel to having fuel that's more psychologically effective against your enemy when somebody's burned and screaming, and that does something to the human psyche when you feel like going back out on patrol after your friend you saw his face melt and scream. But he stood up, the sergeant, put out flames that were on his chest, got behind his medium machine gun. He was hit with shrapnel in the arm, aims in. Also the Marine in the troop compartment communicator stands up. He had a light machine gun. They both aim in and take immediate action on that Toyota Prado. Make quick work of that. Kill the 3 jihadists firing at us. The driver bails out into a ditch, and he he continued to fight against us. Even when we departed, he was firing at us. He testified. This is his real name, Haji Lawani Commandant. He testified against us in the court of inquiry live from a U.S. base in Afghanistan. They paid him the equivalent 3 times for the 3 passengers that were in his vehicle. They paid him 4 years average Afghan salary for each one of their deaths. He had said in 2007, after this, he talks to Naval Criminal Investigative Service, says that there was 3 people. Then they do their investigation. He's a warlord. He's a tribal elder. Has some kind of a senior moment or something, because 2008 during our war crime trial, when he's testifying via video teleconference, he says there was only 2 people, although he's been paid for 3. The Naval Criminal Investigative Service and even the senior Marine colonel that's the legal advisor to this felt very sympathetic. His actual name is Colonel Lecce. He was as crooked as a dog's hind leg. He's mentioned in the book, A Few Bad Men. Yeah. And it feels so sympathetic to this warlord. I had printed out, I'm going to just touch on the wave tops to keep this at the unclassified level. I printed out the whole dossier of Haji Lawani Commandant. Anybody that has access to information can do a deep dive and figure out this guy isn't selling Girl Scout cookies at the grocery store. That's not the purpose of him being out there in that area that morning. Fuel, it just bought massive amounts of fuel that morning, admitted to having fertilizer in his vehicle, says there's no reason at all to have any weapons, that there's nobody firing at Americans. The prosecution, this is a court of inquiry, so it hadn't been used in 50 years. There was no prima facie evidence against us, so they didn't find any body, blood, bullets. So they did this fact-finding thing. So the panel, by military doctrine, it's supposed to be fair, impartial, and unbiased. It's supposed to be fact-finding. So, but the prosecution turned out to be just that, a prosecution. They're completely biased. Yeah. So you had these Marine attorneys that were working for the convening authority, Lieutenant General at that time, Jim Mattis, in charge of taking over investigations, interrogations of U.S. Marines, threatening one of them to deport their family, and thus he signed their statement. He admitted to that on the stand that he was coerced, and he signed that because he was in this dilemma. Is a legal immigrant, is a naturalized, legally U.S. citizen who legally joined the Marine Corps. His crime, he decided he wanted to serve his country during a time of war, and qualified and was selected to become a Marine Special Operator.
So Fred, real
so
fast.
They squeezed him. Yes.
So just to clarify kind of for our listeners what had happened. So, you guys got ambushed. You successfully fought your way out. You guys came back. You're like, sweet, we survived this. You get back, and then all of a sudden they're coming back and saying, hey, this village said you guys attacked a bunch of innocent women and children. That's kind of the gist of it, right?
Yes.
Okay.
So as soon as we got back, that was out on BBC radio. And when I say as soon as we got back, 20 minutes after the attack, we're back on base. Yeah. We get greeted by Marines from our operations center who said, hey, sir, this is already out on BBC radio that you guys murdered civilians. Mm-hmm. So we start having to feed the machine, higher headquarters pushing out information to these guys.
Yeah.
Then the enemy is very good at information warfare. We had not gotten that good at our information loop. So you being in the Air Force, you know about Colonel Boyd and his OODA loop. So we just we weren't even at the OO. We could barely observe and orient. Nobody was deciding or acting at all. Yeah. So we just started getting shelled because there was rioting going on. This got up to the provincial governor, got up to the president of Afghanistan, Hamid Karzai, that he publicly condemned us. The military generals quickly, within 5 days, ceased all of our operations, kicked us out of Afghanistan, and started making, these are American generals and colonels, making comments to the press during an ongoing criminal investigation. And I'll quote, you can web search Colonel John Nicholson and go into the Military Times and go down into some of these links, and you'll find his video to the Pentagon Press Corps where he's stating that this was a terrible, terrible mistake, a stain on our honor, that innocent Afghan civilians were killed by Americans. And then he date stamps that, and he says, he's a lady from Reuters, an interviewer, this is to the Pentagon Press Corps, so multiple members of the media, and he's doing a video teleconference from Afghanistan, and he says she wants to know more information about the attack and our Marine Special Operations Task Force response. He said, I can't comment on any of this because it's currently under a U.S. criminal investigation by the Naval Criminal Investigative Service. So what I just said, Justin, is he already slandered. So
this was before was before they even had any facts as to what had happened. They just basically were like, we're going to scapegoat you because we have to save face to continue our coin strategy is kind of, and I just want to point out too, so your incident, which is probably one of the worst ones because I think so much came on you all at once that they just were looking to throw you under the bus, but this has happened through the special operations community all over the place. I actually have some crew members I served with that were on a 2-ship AC-130 flight in Afghanistan, and this is back before they were only allowed to fly at night. And I'm sure you've probably operated with them plenty of times based off of your skill set. And, he was telling me, and we were stationed in Okinawa together on MC-130s, but he was like, yeah, we were flying and we got engaged. And so this was kind of early in the war. They didn't realize that, hey, some of those C-130s you shoot at actually have the capability to turn and shoot back at you. So sure enough, they did. They engaged. They basically stopped the threat and they continued on. Well, when they landed, similar to your
Everybody
story.
who was killed was at a wedding party.
Yes, you
They
knew
were all.
exactly what I was. Okay, great.
Well, it happened many times, and
Yep.
previous to all this, I used to work with the 353rd Special Operations
Wow.
Group over
Okay.
there in
Yep.
Okinawa many times.
Well,
I was stationed
fantastic.
over there twice, but so this was like an evolutionary cycle, like you said. Didn't just happen to the Marines; it happened to the Air
Hmm.
Force. Special Operations happened to the Army. So the Special Operations Command Central. That's the a two-star general who was in charge of all U.S. Special Forces in the Middle East at the time was a gentleman named Frank Kearney. He's a major
Hmm.
general. So he went on to get promoted and became the vice deputy. He was the second in charge of the U.S. Special Operations Command, but he went public and started condemning us as well.
Wow.
And it's just we had everybody that Army colonel saying this is a terrible, terrible mistake. You had General Kearney making comments to repeated comments to the Washington Post. I'm what I had just mentioned to you, Justin. We all expect that the Taliban is going to have an information warfare arm. What we don't expect is that our own members of the United States military jointly, like
Yeah.
you have multiple members that, I mean, there was an Air Force colonel, CCT guy. He was the commanding
Pihana.
Pihana.
Yep.
He was, one to rush to judgment and slandered us. So he was the worst. He totally tooled the investigation.
I actually wanted to
Uh,
bring that up because early on in the investigation, it sounded like, okay, they brought in a Navy EOD ballistics expert. So for those who are listening, EOD
Joint
is,
Navy and Army.
oh, okay. So that's basically, for those who don't know, that's kind of like a bomb squad, so to speak. And they went in and they found, they took an analysis of your guys' vehicles, and they basically said, hey, your story corroborates like with what we're finding. But then
Yes.
Colonel Pihana basically said, I don't like that answer. I'm going to go talk to these local nationals. And then just he straight up believed their story without any evidence. Why do you think they were so eager to believe that over physical, like ballistic evidence? I just can't fathom that. Like,
So I don't like to have to go to the molecular level, and all my friends say, "Oh, you always go down to the deep dive," but I have to go back a little bit to explain why. So at this time, everybody was seeing what was going on with war crimes allegations and even other cases, such as the Corporal Patrick Tillman case. A lot of senior officers in the U.S. Army Special Operations observed what went on when Mary Tillman, the mother of the late Corporal Pat Tillman, she knew there was an odor. Something was wrong. And they went through 5 investigations before they got to the truth on that. So that with Army and specifically Army Special Operations Command, then you had a case with the Marines in Fallujah, a case with the Marines in Haditha, a case with the Marines in Hamdaniya, Iraq, those 3 in being Iraq. What was going on after that was they found fault with senior level commanders who were the investigating officers who did not act swiftly enough, and they didn't investigate completely. So people were found that, hey, you're going soft on this. And you remember the case in Haditha where a U.S. Congressman, Jack Murtha, who stated that these Marines, referring to those in the Haditha case, killed Iraqis in cold blood, he said. And here was a Vietnam veteran, Murtha, virtue signaling, appealing in the media, stating this publicly during their case. So you have all this political pressure. Now what you're seeing is the pendulum swung the other way. So all of a sudden you had colonels and generals getting like in the Haditha case, they got a letter of censure from the Secretary of the Navy, basically terminating senior officers' career, 2-star in the case of Major General Huck, Colonel Stephen Davis. So
they
all of a sudden
basically,
people are like,
they basically
Bro, the book
created so they basically created an environment where they had to find fault or it was their own career. Like they almost incentivize having to scapegoat you.
yes. Well, they create a situation where you're never going to be wrong if you dogpile, if you go after them overzealously. Hey, we're not investigating enough or fast enough. Let's get somebody over there right away. We'll send an Air Force colonel from Qatar in the Persian Gulf. We'll send him on a plane all the way over to Afghanistan. The deputy, he's the chief of staff actually of the Special Operations Command, Central Command. We'll send him over, and he was, as that sergeant first class, I know his real name. I forget what we pseudo-named him in the book, but he coerced him, and so I'll just use by his first name. Jason stated on the stand that Pihana's his real name. He repeatedly went back to him and tried to coerce him into changing his statement. He said he tried to get me to buckle. So he wanted, now, like I said, this Navy EOD and Army EOD, they were part of this task force Paladin. It's a joint task force that does these post-blast analysis to find out the origin, they're really studying the enemy's tactics, techniques, and procedures for ambushes and what type of attack it was, and put it all in his database so that we have better predictive analytics. And their determination was there was a blast, but what the impacts to our vehicles was from direct fire projectiles, rifles. They even sent the armor on the sides of our vehicle to Georgia and had it looked at by the U.S. Army's Criminal Investigative Division, and it was stated that it was from impacts of Soviet Dragunov sniper rifle. So
the forensic...
Pahana...
Oh, go ahead. Sorry.
Oh, I was going to say Pahana's opined that our Marines either shot our own vehicles
Oh my gosh.
during the attack because we were so afraid. And I don't know, I'm sure have seen a light machine gun, an M249. They stated that the guy in the back troop compartment leaned out over the side of his vehicle with this weapon that's over 3 feet long during the attack and shot the side at 9 o'clock in the morning. But no other Marines, 30 people on the patrol, nobody had any. That was his opinion. So why you would be so biased to think that the Marines, and then he said they could have actually done this before the patrol or during the patrol. But the analysis was that it was from a Soviet Dragunov sniper rifle. So this guy, Pihana, went out there, talked to the tribal elders. The tribal elders originally, and that's why our battalion commander was asking, was it true that you were drunk when you relieved me? Because had to put it in the book after the Pentagon, another government agency doesn't leave a lot to your imagination for those that have been in the military, who these guys were. But they went out immediately, talked to the tribal elders, and one of them comes in my operations center to talk to me that later in that morning, but right after patrol. He says, "Hey, these guys said that you're drunk." And I'm like, "Hey, do you think I'm drunk or do you think that's the kind of outfit that I'm running? That we would leave for a patrol at 6 o'clock in the morning? I don't know anybody that would do all their briefs, rehearsals, and leave at 6 a.m. So you're getting up at like 3 a.m. and you're drunk before. It's absurd, totally defying logic. But that's what this guy believed. And then our own battalion commander gets word of this, and they believe the stupidity. When you go read the book, A Few Bad Men, go to Appendix 3 and read, there's 79 statements that the Afghan locals made. They're so contradictory. They're so stupid and absurd. But like General Mattis had that information. He was the convening authority.
So
again,
can I stop you for 1 sec? Sorry. So there's some confusion too in the chat. So what is the incentive for, going back to what the Afghani locals were saying about you and what you were doing, can you explain the incentive for them to do that in regards to the solicit payments and things like that, just so people can understand what would incentivize them to
Sure.
basically lie about it? Okay, awesome.
Does anyone in the chat, if I mean, I know there's a lot of people in this day and age with COVID that don't want to go back to work. We have a hard time at Tesla getting. Elon Musk even had to come public and say, you can work as much telework as you want, but your first 40 hours are going to be working inside a Tesla facility. So
That's right.
I think most people in today realize that a lot of people, if given the chance to not work and just receive money, they'll do it. But here in this town, if you get 4 years average Afghan salary, so here in America, say somebody was going to give you $250,000, no proof required, no proof at all. But you're a village elder who could kind of encourage you to do this, or maybe you're missing some appendages above your neck. You either going to go down there or face the consequences. So you're either going to get paid 4 years salary for nothing, no proof, or you could face the consequences from your warlord. So hopefully that answers the statement in the chat, because it's absurd what our leaders were believing. They even believed the Afghan elders who said that there was no car bomb at all. The Marines had used, I don't know if you've ever heard of, I mean, you spent time in the military, you probably never heard of this technique that the Afghans said that they use slingshots and hand grenades. So I've never heard of this. I don't know how you'd really do it. Like hold the pin on a grenade.
How would that even work?
Slip your hand in the stationary portion of the slingshot and then pull the grenade back. But they said that we did that to make it look like there was an explosion. And that's in the NCIS statements. So when you read these things that General Mattis had as, again, don't put people in the Pentagon or in charge of all the Marines in the Middle East or all the special operations forces in the Middle East who have 2 and 3 stars that are stupid. Mm-hmm. They knew this information. Even afterwards, after I was relieved, what they send me to do? Well, I was in charge of all the Marine Special Operations Command, the entire components training. So if you literally thought that there was a chance that I would be a mass murderer, would you put me in charge of the training of all these commandos?
Well, it's because they knew you weren't.
They knew I wasn't, but they wanted to believe that, hey, this is the decision we made, so we're going to buck it up. This guy doesn't make any difference what job he has. And as you know, the training programs, there's everything has a nexus to training in special operations. So there's connection to everything, even in administrative, like sexual assault. There's training program for that. So if you want to overwork somebody and find, well, there's some problem in the command, who's in charge of training? You know, you can deep six somebody real easy by making him Cinderella in charge of the training program. But it was really ludicrous what they were believing from the Afghan elders in this Taliban-controlled village.
So they almost created a situation, and I'm sure you agree with me, and everyone, but basically there was no incentive to actually win. The incentive was to not screw up and get in trouble, correct? That would be kind of the general's philosophy. If I go into this theater, or, you know, and I take command of it, as long as I don't screw up, as long as nothing bad happens under me, I was successful. Versus, hey, I need to actually win this war. That seems to be the strategy we took, correct?
Well, I'm just going to throw out some evidence, and you've seen all these people that the war lasted 20 years. So, as I previously mentioned, it was very successful. 2005, Afghanistan was a Sleepy Hollow, and the Marines pulled every single last Marine out of there in 2006. So, how could it be a success when you have all the aviation power that we had? We have unmanned drones, you have drones, armed drones, you have attack aircraft, you have assault support able to stay off the roads and deliver, you know, war fighters all across the battle space. You have intelligence, you have satellite technology, and we're losing to people who their technology consists of primarily rifles
Yep.
designed 2 years after World War II and homemade explosives. They're equipped with running shoes and, you know, a couple magazines strapped to their chest. We're losing. It doesn't make sense unless you start to understand that, okay, now there's incentives. You see what happened to General Petraeus. You know, after he left Iraq, he was later in charge of all forces in Central Command.
Mm-hmm.
Then they relieved McChrystal. They sent, you know, it's actually like a demotion because being in charge of all U.S. forces in the entire Middle East. Then Petraeus went over and was in charge of all forces in Afghanistan, which is technically a demotion, but it's still a 4-star general. But he goes over there, and how's he decide to win the war?
The coin strategy, right?
A coin strategy. He brings, you know, it's ironic because just like the 007 movies where he had this pussy galore, now he invites his paramour, this female Army Reserve major with children. He's married with children. He invites Miss or Major at the time, Paula Broadwell. You know, it's just weird how they have these names, and you know, I'm saying that sarcastically, but it's actually true that, you know, he later goes on, becomes the director of the CIA, and he's messing around with this woman Broadwell.
Yep, I remember that.
But she's over there to write a book, so he's supposed to be fighting this war. Is he fighting the war? No, he's having sex with her while she's writing this book on him. Of course, the situation worsens and worsens. But is it worsening for a reason? I mean, they're tightening, they're restricting the rules of engagement. As you know, they're really trying to go after our technology, saying, oh, the Soviets used these types of techniques with these night raids. They tried to limit us using aviation power. All these accusations that, you know, every bomb drop was this wedding party. And so they really were doing everything to limit night raids, to limit use of aviation ordnance. They're very restrictive of that. You know, they had this CDE, a collateral damage assessment, and if the CDE could be, if it was anything above 0, they would call it off. So basically, the Afghan or the Taliban were using civilians as their shield because they realized, hey, if there's a possibility a civilian could be killed, the Americans wouldn't just not be allowed to drop. We were at that time ordered to withdraw. So
it was incentivized. Yeah, absolutely.
It was incentivized. And, you know, now what do you see? Where is Mattis? Mm-hmm. And that's right. I was mentioning before, he works for the Cohen Group, making these deals with China. He's also working for General Dynamics. Last chairman of Joint Chiefs of Staff, General Dunford, Marine General. He had, after Petraeus, he became in charge, the 4-star general in charge of all U.S. forces in Afghanistan. He's working for Lockheed Martin as a board of directors member. The guy who kicked us out of Afghanistan, then Colonel John Nicholson, got promoted to 4 stars. He was the second to last general in charge of all forces in Afghanistan. He is also a war pimp for Lockheed Martin. That's the nation's the global largest, you know, military industrial complex business in the world. He's over there with his new wife, Noreen, over in Abu Dhabi, in charge of Lockheed's. Wow. He's their chief executive for Middle East operations. So these guys.
Yeah, just to put this into perspective, everybody, basically the generals who kept us in this war for so long are working at the companies who benefit from us being in war forever. So that's kind of, you know, I'm sure you can see the conflict of interest with this.
And as you remember, you can't say that these things are accidental. You look at what happened. I'm going to go back in time just to draw a comparison real quick. December 8th, 1941, the United States rightfully declares war against the Empire of Japan after the attack on Oahu. Wasn't just an attack on Pearl Harbor. 8 military facilities get attacked the same day. We declare war. We immediately launch all joint forces aggressively doing an island hopping campaign. Over 111,000 American forces were killed or missing in action, 250,000 plus wounded in action in the Pacific campaign. Very bloody, very expensive, but we had an unconditional surrender by Emperor Hirohito 3.5 years later. He didn't himself attend the ceremony on the starboard side midship of the USS Missouri, but a nation that didn't lose not just wars, they didn't lose battles until we fought them. They had aircraft carriers. They had aircraft that were higher performing than our aircraft when we entered the Pacific War. They had such great technology and mass numbers that how is America now, 80 years later, incapable of winning guys that wearing sneakers or sandals in many cases, using AK-47 Kalashnikov rifles and homemade explosives? We're losing to these guys? And then how do you think it's by coincidence that you have served in the Air Force and you realize, just like in the Marines, Air Force and Marines are very knowledgeable about non-combatant evacuation operations. And when you were there in Okinawa, that's kind of like a bread and butter mission when these typhoons rip through the Philippines and all these countries. But who, by doctrine, for non-combatant evacuation operations, I'm going to get to my point here in a second, who is the U.S. State Department obligated to evacuate first? American citizens. What happened just over a year ago in Afghanistan? That first C-17 took over 683, a record 683 passengers, 683 souls flew out of Kabul in an Air Force C-17 that were Afghans. Why in the hell we load, the Department of State's procedures and in coordination with the Department of Defense is that you triage, you first of all, you notify all American citizens, you tell them where to muster, and they are the first ones obligated to be processed. Priority one. I've done this, you've done this, I'm assuming you've done this. This is like 101. So do you think that it was accidental that these 4 stars, this was politically driven, hey, get out before September 11th. Do you think that they're that stupid that they just fumbled it this bad? The military calls it A pods or S pods. These are air points of departure or C points of departure. And you have multiple for redundancy. You never go down to one unless there's no other way.
No other way, yeah.
This was done the complete opposite, and this was a deliberately planned mission. This wasn't in extremis, ad hoc, just no other alternatives. My question here, when you talk about incentives, and the Pentagon wants a forever war, and the commander-in-chief says, go and get out of there, it seems an awful lot to me like, we'll show you the tail wags the dog, not the other way around. And we're going to leave $7 billion worth of equipment there because guess what? That's money that we'll get back. We're going to need to recover that anyway. We've got more to sell you. Just like this. Does anybody know who our current Secretary of Defense is and where he came from? That Secretary Austin used to work for Raytheon. Raytheon and Lockheed. What's one of the products they make? That's right, the Javelin missile, which we've given a third of our
to Ukraine,
war supply to Ukraine. We've given 5,000 of these things right at the same time right now that the Marine Corps is reinvented itself in this reorganization. Guess what? We got rid of 100% of our tanks, even in the reserves, gone, because guess what? We're going to rely on these missiles, these shoulder fire missiles. Oh, well, when we give a third of it to Ukraine, that's okay, because they'll just make more. Who's the last chairman of Joint Chiefs of Staff? Joe Dunford. Where does he work? Lockheed Martin. Current Secretary of Defense. It's this revolving door. So if you don't see this no general left behind program, basically, if you retire out of Tampa, like General Mattis, who's in charge of all forces of the Middle East, commanding general Central Command. General Lloyd Austin, the current Secretary of Defense, retired out of Central Command as commanding general. General Dunford, the last chairman of Joint Chiefs of Staff, senior officer in entire U.S. military, works for Lockheed Martin. All these, essentially, they're war pimps. They get paid. And if you look at what's happened over the last 21 years while we were in these forever wars in the Middle East, what did China do? Besides policing up all these logistical resources, building this, overland and maritime silk routes across the world. They've gotten all these natural resources. They've brokered deals in this One Belt, One Road initiative with over 140 nations that are now client states of People's Republic of China. All roads lead back to Beijing. So they were doing this while we were having a few oligarchs get filthy rich, over wars in the Middle East. And now,
and to add to
the
that,
strategy, we're screwed.
Well, we are. Well, and to add to that, I mean, the proof is in our 20-year military buildup, where we've been completely revamping our military for aconventional warfare. And if you think about it, like, are we even in a state where we could fight a conventional war against a country like Russia? I mean, because we really haven't concentrated on conventional warfare like we had historically. So it's really scary to think about that. You said it in your book, Russia and China are bolstering their militaries while we're just making this war pimp money machine. And we're really building technology to not win a war for wars that we're not even going to potentially fight against real threats. And it's kind of scary to think about that.
So I'm not going to get into any classified plans, but I'm just going to ask a question to your listeners that could put some comments in the chat. So we realize that could be most dangerous course of action with Russia and China doing something simultaneously. And if you don't believe, look what just happened in August with this. You could web search. There's other titles named Exercise Sniper Frontier. So do a little deep dive and search in the Google for Exercise Sniper Frontier. It's this exercise that Maduro, Venezuela just hosted right here in the Americas, 1,700 miles south of our southern shores of Florida, with 13 nations, to include Iran, Russia, and China. Right, forget the Monroe Doctrine. It's right here in our front yard. We're not talking about, on some other side of the globe. They're getting offensive. Now, let's put in the chat, how many of your listeners think that China will restrain itself and that we'll actually go ahead and take a defensive posture and start positioning forces on Taiwan to defend it before China? Okay, you've been stationed in Okinawa.
Yep, that's what we were there for.
People's Liberation Army, they're 96 miles west. Who do you think is going to, I want your listeners to put in the chat, who do you think will get to Taipei first? People's Liberation Army, United States military. Who do you think's doing more offensive, larger scoped operations right now, especially since this last year's fumble in Afghanistan? Just look at all the increased frequency and larger scope amphibious operations that China's doing on their eastern coast. We're not doing anything that size. But you also, let's look at this last year after this fumble in Afghanistan where we gave $7 billion of equipment, the worst optics that you could possibly have. You've had North Korea launch 31 ballistic missiles, not covered by our mainstream media. Look it up. Don't take my word for it. You've had Russia invade Ukraine. You've had all these increased frequency of these amphibious operations off China's east coast. You have this exercise in the Caribbean, like I just mentioned, with 13 countries. We are perceived for what we, our nation is not the symbol of strength that it once was, especially after last year. These weren't going on a couple years ago, but when they realized that these guys can't even get an evacuation of their own citizens, right, after they've been there for 20 years, they've fumbled that as badly as you possibly can. So my point is, why did I ask your listeners who's going to get there first?
And the consensus
Guess.
seems to be China, with some saying China, but they won't be able to necessarily hold it. So, yeah,
So,
what's your opinion?
so no, that's my exact point, Justin, is there's two main ways that we're going to get. Yeah, you can have bombardment all you want. Aviation power doesn't take land. But there's two ways to dislodge the People's Liberation Army from Taiwan. Amphibious and or airborne operations.
Mm-hmm.
That is very costly as far as lives, and it's very expensive. But if you have long calls in Northrop Grumman, General Dynamics, Lockheed Martin, and you know when to buy it, if you have the answers to the test, you're going to get filthy rich. But you have to just mortgage your soul if you're willing to gamble with the lives of the sons and daughters of America, of those who today are serving or tomorrow will be serving. But our military is there not only to deter aggression, but to fight when it's time to, when aggression occurs. And right now, you read the tea leaves, you see what's going on. President of Ukraine wanting to get into NATO, something like that could draw us into a war. What incident? Follow the money. Who benefits from this? I mean, this is stuff just happening at the end of last week. That's been in the making, but pretty scary stuff. And
it really is.
So,
well,
it's not going to benefit everybody in America, but it will benefit some. And just like these wars, they didn't benefit most Americans, but they benefited some people a lot. And I'm talking about retired generals, $203,000 annual pension. They can live wherever they want. They get flown the corporate plane. Justin, you've landed at Reagan and Dulles. You see the names on all tops of the buildings when you fly around the Pentagon or the intelligence community. Those are the people that are making all the decisions. We're talking to the Department of Defense. The number one non-discretionary spending in the United States federal budget is the Department of Defense. These people, those names on the tops of those buildings around the Pentagon and the intelligence community, those are the Geppettos pulling the strings on these retired four-star generals.
Yep. We had somebody.
And don't take my word.
No, it's true. We had somebody in the chat saying generals from World War II would be disgusted. I think it's true. You know,
Well, Eisenhower was the one who said, "You better watch out," or they're going to be essentially the fourth branch of the federal government. So,
no, that is true. Well, I know we kind of got off track, and it was an amazing conversation. So I'm glad we just had it. But I kind of want to return back to your court proceeding, and can you kind of clarify for everybody the difference between a court martial and a court of inquiry? Because everybody's kind of familiar with the term court martial, but a lot of people aren't really sure what a court of inquiry actually is and what the difference is. Do you have the same due process and same rights when you undergo a court of inquiry as you would in like a civilian trial or a court martial?
It's a great question. So, and I'm not a lawyer, not trying to play the sea lawyer. I'm just going to tell you what my lawyers have said, because that's the best thing I can do is repeat what my legal counsel has said. One, they said when they don't have prima facie evidence, they don't have body, they don't have blood, it's hearsay, conjecture, he said, she said. So there's no proof of anything. So now we've got to a fact-finding mission, because there's no smoking gun. You can use a court of inquiry. Now, what's also said in the book, and what my attorney said, and what a mentor of mine, who at the time he was the operations officer for Marine Special Operations Command, was full-bird colonel, and he left the Special Operations Command. He took over just over 2,000 Marines that went to fly to Afghanistan right immediately after the court of inquiry. But he told me, he said, prior to going into the court, he said, "Fred, you need to be very careful. As a court of inquiry, there are no rules of evidence. They can introduce anything." So it's like a battle royale. No rules, anything goes, steel chair. You've seen for those that used to watch wrestling, it's like, which is kind of a, entertainment, but sadly, that's what this kangaroo court turned out to be. They being the convening authority allowed this mayhem to go on, this dogpiling by 45 criminal investigators, 4 prosecuting attorneys. It's not made up, and I've said this just Google search Fred Galvin, ABC. Just Google search it sometime. Go to about the 3-minute mark and listen to one of the Marines, in his own words, talk about how his family was threatened to be deported unless he signed that statement, which he did. He admits it. But so here's the difference in a court-martial. Court-martial, they're not allowed to do this this tactic, which is, I'll say it for what it is. It's completely un-American, because what does the First Amendment right guarantee? One of the things is our freedom of speech. It prohibits censure. Now, those of us in the military realize that there are certain things that are classified due to national security. The Security Classification Guide, for those of you who've been in the military, understand that it is prohibited to classify anything strictly for the purposes of saving someone from embarrassment. You cannot do that. However, in this court, what I had described to you in this gun battle that we were caught in is not Jason Bourne's knock list. This is a garden variety gun battle. We got shot at, blown up, sniper fire coming in at us. Nothing in there is classified. So why did all these senior officers who got called in, some of them refused to even talk, and they got away with it. They didn't have to. And they had evidence. And some of them, every time they had evidence that could come back to bite them in the butt, they'd move the media out of the courtroom. All defense witnesses that had any exculpatory evidence, and even defense witnesses that had never been in Afghanistan, they were just character witnesses these are people that had nothing classified. They were just saying, Fred Galvin's X, Y, or Z, you make up your own mind. Google search Colonel Smith, Colonel Boudreaux, Colonel Petranzio. These are people that hadn't been to Afghanistan at that time, just character witnesses.
Wow.
You're not going to find their name in the media. You know why? Because this is the difference between a court of inquiry and court-martial, is they started turning this kangaroo court, and they'd move the media out. So although the jury heard every single word and they made a recommendation, the media didn't. So the media was left hearing one side of the story, and that was what the prosecution was accusing us of is mass murder, and that we had a conspiracy to cover it up.
And I'll point out to the chat real quick too. So I know when you underwent this court of inquiry, they basically placed a gag order on you saying, hey, you're not allowed to talk to the media, but all these generals were allowed to talk about you to the media. And then on top of that, they had you come in your your fatigues, not your dress uniform, because they didn't want you showing off your medals. Do you think all this was done so that they could control the media narrative to guarantee a conviction against you guys?
Well, it was definitely shaping operations. And those of you who've been in the military and who understand the doctrinal definition of an information operation, that's when you distort information to disrupt your enemy. So we're allowed, when we're approved by the combatant commander for the area, the geographic area that we're going into, they can approve both information operations and or psychological operations against the enemy. It is unlawful to do information operations against your own troops and against the American people. You cannot do that. So when you understand the Constitution, First Amendment, freedom of speech, when you put a censure on this, a gag order, again, when people raise their right hand, you and I did this, you swear, you make an oath, you swear to defend the Constitution of the United States against all enemies, foreign and domestic. This is exactly what I'm talking about. People in America don't like to use the word traitor. They don't even connect an example of treason. Maybe that Benedict Arnold is, because that's something that's so immoral. You think of somebody like Judas. These people, these characters in history that are real people, they didn't paint them well in history. So we don't even like to think of people doing stuff like this. But do you think General Mattis is the convening authority when you take that oath to defend the Constitution? And that's how you start the oath. How you end the oath, as you know, is that you will faithfully discharge the duties of your office, so help you God.
Mm-hmm.
Just ask the listeners, put it in the chat if you think putting a gag order against not just myself and the other co-defendant, but the gag order, of course they term it protective order. It was to protect us, but it's saying
right.
that we couldn't say anything. They use these well-crafted, carefully crafted words by their attorney. It even said that if our counsel, to include our civilian counsel, said anything to the press, they would send a letter to their state's board requesting that they be disbarred. So, I mean, this has never happened. But when they use these strong-arm tactics, which basically shut us up, they're shaping, this is an information operation. When there's no reason for a court of inquiry over a gunfight to continually move, not just defense witnesses with exculpatory evidence, but character witnesses, you're moving the media out during all this. You're classifying a guy like Colonel Nicholson, the guy that says it's a terrible, terrible mistake, staying on our honor. He didn't go out on any missions with us. He didn't have intricate knowledge of our intelligence capabilities in MARSOC. Mm-hmm. He was the conventional battle space commander. He was a colonel in charge. Why was his testimony classified? Well, I'll tell you something, Justin. It took me 11 years. I had 2 separate attorneys, filed in federal court twice to get the Special Operations Command to declassify the Article 15-6 preliminary investigation, and to get the Marine Central Command, because you'd think, why wasn't this court of inquiry held by the Marine Special Operations Command? Well, Marine Special Operations Command, it's a hierarchy. It's a 2-star general. The guy wants to get promoted to 3 stars, and guess what? He did. So he defaults. He lets the conventional Marine Corps, and from being in Air Force Special Operations, this wouldn't happen in other branches of Special Operations. He lets the conventional commanders. So General Mattis never was in Special Operations. He was a convening authority. Mm-hmm. And they, were the judge jury of this case. You'd never have something in the Air Force Special Operations Command be handled by big Air Force. But they did this because they knew how to handle this. They knew what the outcome that they wanted, and that's what they released. And that something is so dirty that after a case, and the average case is normally adjudicated the day after the trial at the latest, they waited 4 months at the end of our case happened from the 7th to the 29th of January 2008. They waited and released this on, is it 23rd, I think?
That's right.
I think it was the 23rd of May.
Was it Friday? Was it probably a Friday?
Friday,
Yep.
Memorial Day weekend. One of the few weekends that the Pentagon has a 4-day on Memorial Day weekend. So they come back, they get rid of it on Friday. The convening authority releases this to Estes Thompson, only single source. They go to, he's the reporter that was in court of inquiry from the Associated Press. They release to Estes Thompson, one source, on Friday night. So right before they leave for a 4-day weekend, coming back on Wednesday, news cycle, press release, everybody knows it's going to be totally different on Wednesday. They use non-legal terms. They said that we acted appropriately. And Justin, I'm not asking you to incriminate yourself, but you probably were either a witness or been in some military justice case in some form or capacity. There's 3 ways that you end any military justice case. It's either guilty, innocent, or dismissed. I've been a commander. Those are the only things that you can actually decide on. Not you acted appropriately.
Yeah.
So they said we acted appropriately. Afghans started to protest again. the press filleted us, not just then, they continued to do it for over 7 more years.
Wow.
I was not able to get promoted because I had this adverse material, and that's a whole nother separate subject. That the last chairman of Joint Chiefs of Staff, before he was the chairman, he was the Commandant of the Marine Corps. In 2015, he said to 5 members of Congress, these are senators and congressmen who sat on both the Senate and the House Armed Services Committees, he said, no adverse judicial or administrative action was entered on any of these Marines' records. Then after that, that was 2015, 2019, the Department of Navy, God bless her soul, Catherine Kesselmeyer, she was general counsel for the Department of Navy, she released a scathing 12-page explicit letter saying,
awesome.
remove this adverse material out of Galvin's record. But so when you submit false official statements to members of Congress multiple times, you've had interaction with general officers and people in their staffs. Do they put an incorrect date or information? If it's going to not just
it goes through 500 people before it even gets released, so there's no way.
And that's if it's going to like a 3 or 4 star, especially like if it's going to a service chief, especially if it's going to a congressman or woman, a senator, people that sit on the Senate or House, it's going through so many layers. There's no accidental, oh, we missed it. Oh my goodness, the commanding officer, we dumped all this. He was the scapegoat. That wasn't something they overlooked. That's something that they knew. That was a complete lie. And when you submit a false official statement to members, that's a felony.
But nothing's happened. Nope.
Well, no, that's not true. Now, he retired, and now he's on the board at Lockheed Martin, getting paid a lot more. So these guys get rewarded. And, I mean, this book comes out, and I've given many interviews telling all about this. Has anything happened? Not a single thing.
Well, at least...
because America doesn't really care.
And that is the sad truth. And at least the Department of Navy came out with the records correction. But do you think the Marine Corps will ever, apologize for what happened or correct the record?
So the reason I say no is God rest his soul. The late Congressman Walter B. Jones, in 2017, he was the sponsor of House Resolution 21. Ask your listeners, Google search House Resolution 21, 115th Congress. It was a resolution that states the purpose. You can click on the actual in house.gov and look this up. It says to have the Commandant of the Marine Corps make an official statement that the Marines of Marine Special Operations Company Foxtrot were not at fault in the ambush on 4 March 2007. Commandant of the Marine Corps at that time was General Neller. Sat on it for 2 years, did nothing. So that indecision, that kind of indifference. So we have leadership traits in the Marine Corps. All these services have their core values and leadership traits, but one of them is justice. One of them is decisiveness. One of them is courage. And, the Marine Corps prides itself on the top 2 things for leaders is you accomplish the mission, take care of your troops, the troop morale. You would think that when this happened 15 and a half years ago, you've got a #1 bestseller book that people know about, that you can't buy this on any military bookstore. Again, smells like an odor of censor there, but they're not going to let it be sold. They're not going to say a word about it. They just want it to go away. Wow. Just like Hillary Clinton and the Benghazi case. You read about in this book, there was a connection between myself and our platoon that went into Tripoli the day after Libya, the day after Benghazi went down. So I'm saying that not politically, but it wasn't because some video was released.
Oh, absolutely not.
Young Marines knew that day, but that's what story they cooked up.
Well, that's another example of just a complete failure of the State Department and the military. We had kind of talked about this previously, but the unit I was assigned to at the time was basically responsible for a lot of that with the Foreign Emergency Support Team. And, we got told, hey, this is going on, get ready to go. And then we were never sent. And who knows, I might have been your airlift, who knows. But we, the vice director of counterterrorism for the State Department basically whistleblew in front of Congress, and he was like, "Hey, we have this dedicated team that's meant to support embassies when they're under attack, and we were told not to go." And of course, the liberal, like, they piled on him. They're like, "Well, don't you think your superiors would know better if you needed to go, if you were going to make it in time?" And he basically told them flat out, he's like, "We might not have made it in time, but we didn't have the gift of hindsight at that time. So you don't know how long the battle's going to last. You go and you position, you get ready. But the fact that we spend millions of dollars on these task-specific things and then they just don't even get activated is just mind-blowing." And it's like, what politics were at play to where they couldn't send anybody in there? And I know there's a lot of conspiracy theories or non-conspiracy theories about it, but it's just...
Well, the facts were is Chris Stevens sent over 200 communiques. That caused us to reposition our force. So first, the Air Force brothers came down to Spain where we were positioned. Then I know the Air Force has a higher goal of as far as quality of life. After a while,
hey, don't judge.
That air crew, the small number of the air crew, they won out, and we had to move over 50 Marines up to Ramstein, and so we were hanging out there until September 12th, 2012, the day after Benghazi fell.
Yeah.
But the fact of the matter is, a FAST team in the Marines is like a SWAT team. You go there optimally to ahead of time to deter, but if not, the capabilities there to recapture a vital national or naval asset. Unfortunately, it was too late. So these communications, the correct answer to that statement from Congress would have been no. I don't think that they knew better, because we did know that there was an imminent attack that was coming, but they wanted to make it seem like peace was just breaking out in the Middle East and in Northern Africa, when in fact it wasn't, and American lives were lost. We are obligated to protect those American lives and to tell the truth. And just like this one general, he was a colonel at the time, the one who said this is a terrible, terrible mistake, the guy who stated that and then date stamps it by saying, "I can't say anything because we're having an ongoing criminal investigation." That ironically, his task force that he named, he was in charge of, he was the commanding officer as a colonel of Task Force Spartan. America loves watching that movie 300, and the Spartans, they were so, they held people accountable for the words that they said. Isn't it ironic? Here's the commanding officer of Task Force Spartan, and you want to know what he said in go to SOFREP. Some of your listeners have read, it stands for Special Operations Forces Report. There's a 5-part series that a reporter, Nick Kaufman, did, and before the book came out, I was his Enigma machine. They just started to declassify this, and he didn't even really, he just put the exact, you'll see the secret no foreign lines through it. He put the exact transcripts from the court of inquiry, and I gave him the nouns of who's saying what. So you have Nicholson in one of these 5-part series stating that I didn't see that. Here's the guy who admitted that, or said that it was a terrible, terrible mistake, then admitted in the courtroom, but this was classified. There's no reason. Says that if I had known that, he's like, I had that information. I should have read it. I don't see how I couldn't have. He was urging to get us kicked out. And he said, if now that I see this, I would definitely have taken a knee and drink water. Basically, meaning in Army lingo, he would have given us the benefit of the doubt and not urged to kick us out. That was during his testimony in court under oath, January 2008. You go through the book, A Few Bad Men, you see he invites Carlotta Gall, New York Times reporter, into his office in the Pentagon in 2012. She's doing an interview for her book, The Wrong Enemy. Don't take my word for this. Put a page 116 in there. I know this. Trust me, I know everything about this case. He says in there, even after he admits that he was wrong under sworn testimony, which he thought would never get declassified, says there was problems with leadership, discipline, and training. So he continues to perpetuate that the Marines were at fault, doesn't give us the benefit of the doubt, although he's admitted 4 years earlier on the stand that he was wrong, that he would have given us the benefit of the doubt, and that he shouldn't have said that. He continues to perpetuate it 4 years later after he knew beyond a shadow of a doubt that he was wrong, we're right, and he continues to throw us under the bus with slander.
Jeez.
And guess what? Fred Galvin's still faithfully serving in the Marine Corps out there overseas at that time. And, here's this guy, he ditches his old wife, marries this new lawyer, upgrades, and then, brings this girl, see this trend, like Petraeus brings this Parmore and writes this book. So he brings this other girl, she's in New York, he didn't have an affair with her that I know of, brings her into the Pentagon, has her pen this statement from him where he throws us under the bus again and continually gets promoted. So it's not, as you said earlier in this interview, these guys aren't winning the war. So here you have these social justice warriors, these virtue signaling by throwing people under the bus, just like these Pharisees, being the critics, accusing the man in the arena, pointing the finger. I would never. These guys are killing civilians, women and children. They went door to door. This is what the Afghan civilians said. The Afghan elders said that we went door to door, sport killing these women, children, elderly. I'm not even embellishing. The Afghans said that we were even killing farm animals. And you believe this? And I mean, none of the evidence.
They get more payment
there
for each death, right?
Yeah.
I mean, it's totally incentivized for them to do that. It's crazy. And I really appreciate you. I could pick your brain all day. Just to kind of respect everyone's time, I'm going to ask you a few questions that other people had, and we'll kind of start with some of the book club people. But the first thing, Look Ahead America, we're a big advocate for the J6 prisoners that were wrongfully imprisoned. I mean, we all acknowledge ones that, causing violence, the due process needs to move forward. But there's a lot of people that day that have basically had the weight on the state of them to make an example, that were just ushered in. They were just, like grandmas and stuff going in because they were let in. And, we've talked to a lot of them, and they tell us how hard it was to have the weight of the state on them. But I look at you, and you had the weight of the military, the weight of the state on you, but you also had, you needed to win your court of inquiry for the sake of all your men, because had you had lost, they would have come for all of them. So how was it mentally for you? Like, how were you able, honestly, in your book, you seem like you kept it together really well. I feel like, honestly, I probably would have just lost my mind. How were you able to keep it all together? Did it take its toll on you mentally? Did it take any years off your life, you think? How was that experience?
Okay, 2007 is when the ambush occurred. 2008 is when the court of inquiry happened, when General Mattis unleashed those 49 investigators and prosecutors against the 7 of us. We don't fight odds that are 7-1. And, another thing my attorney said is, at that time, in the Marine Corps, if you went into a court, the conviction rate was 96%. The next highest at that time was the People's Republic of China, not known for their human rights, 92%. So this is background, some color, having understanding of, I'm one of 2 co-defendants. I'm the commanding officer of this task force. I got another one of my platoon commanders going in the courtroom with me. I just spoke to him this morning. Great American, continuing to serve his country, hero. This guy shot in the middle of his thigh in the Battle of Fallujah with a 12.7 millimeter Soviet heavy machine gun in the Battle of Fallujah. Fights, recovers, trains, and passes the force reconnaissance indoctrination. Goes to the amphibious reconnaissance course. Becomes our first special operations platoon commander and our first Marine Special Operations Task Force. Just a champion. To this day, he's still serving. A hero. this is the type of caliber, but the two of us go in there. At that time in 2008, the United States Department of Defense, when you add up all active, reserve, civilian contractors, it dwarfed the number 2 and 3 employers in the United States combined. So you combine the number 2 and 3, we still dwarfed that at that time. Until just recently, if you took number 2 and 3, Walmart and Amazon, it's still, until just recently, it dwarfed both combined. But at that time, so I'm saying is, there was a lot of pressure. This is the nation's largest employer. Like I mentioned, it's what America spends. It's non-discretionary spending after you take away all entitlements. It's what we spend most of our money on. And now they're using not just a legal proceeding like a court of inquiry, but they're doing so in a way that's completely unethical. They're having senior officers like Major General Frank Kearney making repeated comments in the Washington Post, who had twisted his chief of staff, who was his puppet, Colonel Pahana, who 6 months before was investigating officer for a Green Beret team, ODA 374. Captain Dave Stafel was their team leader of that ODA, who they went out on an approved capture-kill mission for an Afghan there in Regional Command East. They knew who this guy was. He's a facilitator for suicide bombers. They positively ID'd him, shot him in the head. Only that person was shot. Just one shot was taken. Shot and killed this guy. Clean shoot. Army Criminal Investigative Division said it was clean shoot. Pahana goes in there, criminal investigator, and they ended up charging Captain Dave Stafel and his team sergeant, Master Sergeant Troy Anderson, with homicide. Same thing they charged us with. So you see this trend where no longer are the hall passes given out, no longer the benefit of the doubt. After the Tillman case, Hilario Pantano's case in Fallujah, Haditha, Hamidaniya cases, now the way to get promoted is throw your own guys under the bus.
Yep.
It's never going to be at fault for aggressively investigating, because that was the problem, is that people didn't aggressively investigate. So you just need to ramp it up, and that's what happened. So what went on was very unethical.
You hired a civilian lawyer, or I mean, I guess, who worked in military cases, but how much debt did you end up incurring, if you don't mind me asking? I mean, you don't have to give me a hard number, but was it a lot? I mean, I'm sure it wasn't cheap.
I was just talking to a buddy of mine. He's talking about his divorce attorney. He's like, I'm racking up stuff. This isn't a minor infraction like jaywalking or a seventh can of beer in the barracks. Something. This is homicide. This is mass murder.
Yeah.
This is the largest number of Afghans. So you're talking pine boxes, and people think like, well, come on, this was just a process. Okay.
No.
Anybody remember the name Major Hassan, the former Major Hassan Nadal, the shooter from Fort Hood, Texas? Yeah, yep. He was found guilty. You know what his sentence is? Death.
Yeah.
Still on the books. Same charge. He didn't kill. He wasn't alleged to kill as many. This is what I want your listeners to understand. This is what's still on the books. This is but how the military. Now, I haven't heard of anybody's cases so unethical, and as like you had mentioned, it's probably documented in the book. You could Google search Fred Galvin, you'll see me walking into a courtroom, longest trial in Marine Corps history, 3.5 weeks. I didn't go in there and a dress uniform like Eddie Gallagher did, during his Navy SEAL case. I wasn't walking in. We don't have whites, but yeah, you're not going to be like. Anybody ever watched the movie A Few Good Men, like Colonel Nathan Jessup? Mm-hmm. If you look at any other case, when you go into a court, you're wearing a service uniform. Do you ever see anybody pictured anything but? Now, in Article 32, yeah, but I'm talking a court, like a court of inquiry, a court martial. So they really did a lot of shaping operations to distort the truth and to get the optics to make it. I mean, they didn't want Vince. I don't want to say his name. They didn't want the other co-defendant who I mentioned,
Yeah.
nearly bled out and died, and they had his
Oh.
leg almost had his leg amputated. And myself, they didn't want us walking into the courtroom. I mean, at that time of the trial, I'd been in over 20 years.
Yeah. So
They
you had
didn't
a big
want,
rack, is what you're saying at that point.
yeah,
Yeah.
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 So they wanted this to go the direction that they wanted it, and they were very, I won't say moral, but I will say smart as far as how they shaped this, but it was very unethical. And the reason that I wrote a book and that I'm continuing to, you're like, hey, our group's smaller than Tucker Carlson. I don't care, because America needs to let this soak in that there are 3 special operators in the same command that I served in right now, accused of a separate incident that happened on January 1st, 2019. A retired Green Beret attacked a Marine gunnery sergeant, happens to be African American, slugged him in the face twice, and as he's coming in to punch this Marine gunnery sergeant in the face, this is a 275-pound bodybuilder that surrounded these 3 special operators with 7 of his buddies in Erbil, Iraq. Coming in on his 3rd strike, this other Marine gunnery sergeant comes in, punches him in the face once. Rick Rodriguez, the retired Green Beret, falls back, hits his head on the ground, becomes unconscious. One of the 3 of the special operators was a Marine, or was assigned to the Marine Special Operations Command, was a Navy Special Operations Corpsman. Immediately treats him. They immediately report it. They evacuate him. They watch him overnight. They evacuate him to Landstuhl. He dies. This happened New Year's Eve. He dies on the 4th of January 2019. All 3 of these guys are charged with homicide. Why do I bring this up? Google search MARSOC 3 and see the corruption in this case. They tried to put a gag order on them, and it failed. And then they sent a colonel, one of the senior Marine lawyers. We have only colonels, then we go up to a 2-star in legal. They sent a colonel from the Pentagon, the Judge Advocate Division, Colonel Christopher Shaw. Maybe just coincidentally just gets lost and drives down 5 hours south down the road to Camp Lejeune, North Carolina. Threatens 8 Marine defense attorneys, to include an attorney for one of these special operators, by stating that I know what cases you're going to be working on. Your fitness report, the evaluation they write on these attorneys, that may shield you, but you're not protected. The colonel who sits on that promotion board will know the case you're working on. He will know who you are, and you're not protected. So all 8 of these attorneys, these Marine defense attorneys, write sworn affidavits that this colonel comes down there, threatens them. So right before they go to their case, right after the 3-year mark that they've been charged, they use a strong arm tactic. I mean, something you'd use when you know your case is weak, when this case is dragged out for over 3 years. So February 9th, 2022, earlier this year, Navy judge throws the case out with prejudice, dismisses it with prejudice. The Marine Corps files an appeal August, just over a month ago, wins. They
Yeah,
won.
I just saw that. Yeah.
So these 3, when people say, so what, what's going on? Why are you making so much noise about this? This type of abuse, when a criminal realizes they've gotten away with something that's wrong, it emboldens them.
Yep.
The people, we are not a democracy. We are a republic. There's a difference. So in our nation, we elect leaders who are supposed to represent, that means work, supposed to be sent there to work for us, and they are allowing this to happen. I'm asking your listeners to do, never ask for a penny. I won't. I want 5 minutes of your time tomorrow. Go and figure out who you're going to vote for tomorrow, at least your district congressman or woman. I type in congress.gov/members, find out who your current member of Congress is, and say, I want you to bring the service chief into your office or a session of Congress and testify what in the hell is going on in the MARSOC 3 case. And here's the bigger implication. Justin, if you got attacked tonight, say you're out with your wife and kids and you were attacked and you can't defend, this is the bigger implication. If you forfeit your right of self-defense, which is now Marines are taught from the time they're in recruit training, the Marine Corps martial arts program, until the day they get out of the Marine Corps. It's a belt system. You have a colored system of belts. You can't get promoted unless you move up to the next belt. And it's about, there's all this moral training in it that you don't use excessive amount of force. And they showed restraint. They didn't attack any of the other 7 guys that Rick Rodriguez was with. The 3 Marines, they didn't dogpile on the guy who was attacked. It was just one punch. Did they show restraint? Yes. Did they try to cover it up? No. Did they report it immediately? Yes. Did they treat him? Yes. Did they watch him overnight? Yes. Was this recorded in a surveillance video that night? Yes. Has that been reviewed in court? Yes. This is cut and dry. But when you're making, just like in our case, we were attacked. When you're making the warriors on the front line hesitant on even defending themselves, what's the purpose of even having the military?
Well, I think we have just a problem culturally with that. I mean, you see, not to get off on
Cops.
too much of Antifa, when they cause all this damage and violence, and then they just get let off. But anybody who defends themselves against them will see, their day in court. And it is scary, because I think about that when I'm out with my family. Like, if I had to defend myself, what are the implications of that going to be? And I highly recommend the Law of Self-Defense book to anybody that's listening, just because it teaches you how to make yourself hard to kill, but hard to convict as well. It is scary. But all right, so let me get through these questions real quick. So we had one from somebody, our user Funky for Real. He says, do you think the strict rules of engagement placed upon the U.S. military in Afghanistan led to more U.S. casualties? And was the stricter rules of engagement a purely political move by the Obama administration?
Good question. So there's a lot of perception. The rules of engagement, like I mentioned earlier, May 2006, Google search, May 2006, Karzai, Bush. They met in the White House during the Bush administration, May 2006. Now, the reason that's so important is our military leaders couldn't have decided like, oh, this is a good deal, but that's when they wanted, Karzai said, I want a nation. He's the president, so of course, he wants to survive. So he wants the military to stay. The military realizes, like, we're not in nation building, but people began to understand this is an opportunity. And so why do I say 2006 nation building, Hamid Karzai president? So one, this was just only continued by the Obama, but it started in the Bush administration. Politicians are politicians. It's the generals that are over there developing these counterinsurgency strategies. So they've taken it down from the media, but go back and Google search the first 5-part series where Nicholson is stated in the Special Operations Force, the SOFREP report, the one of those 5 installations that's on Colonel John Nicholson. And you read in his statement that he boasts about having the highest casualty rate. Now, he was over there for just over a year in 2006 and 2007, and boasts about having the highest casualty rate. And you read about his command leadership style in A Few Bad Men, that his subordinate commander, then Lieutenant Colonel Chris Cavoli, who was a battalion commander, now he's in charge, is the SAC year, the Supreme Allied Commander Europe. It's a 4-star. This guy, Chris Cavoli, sawed-off short little guy, states, he was telling me this to my face. I've drove around in his vehicle with him for days when he first got into Afghanistan. He's like, we want to show that we come in peace. I don't even have a machine gun or a turret gunner in my turret. I put a spare tire on top of my Humvee. So here's his battalion commander, and that's what he says to me. He's driving around. Those are facts. That happened. And you have Colonel Nicholson stating on NBC News, which is recorded on SOFREP, his NBC News, I can't even find that anymore. But when it was still up and Nick Kaufman wrote that article in SOFREP, he boasts about having the highest the highest death and highest wounded in action up to that point.
Why would he
So
brag
yes,
about that? That's the dumbest thing to brag about.
well, and at that time, it was okay to get your own guys killed, but if you kill some civilians, you're done, because that's this whole nation building. We're there to protect them, not protect America.
Who was the officer in your book? And I forget what you were doing, but basically you were getting attacked, and I'm trying to remember this correctly, but you were like, hey, we need to call in an airstrike or something, and he basically held off until the point where the enemy was so close that it would have killed your own men. And then he was wanting to just use huge ordnance against them. And afterwards, you kind of got onto him, like told him, hey, you did a crappy job. And he's like, essentially said, I'm willing to sacrifice my own men. I don't remember the exact story, but
now you're going to think I'm an idiot because this doesn't paint me in a popular light. But so we did get acquitted from the court of inquiry trial. I immediately requested to go overseas. I did, and go back to Afghanistan. I'm on another deployment. This is 2011. The battalion commander had never been to Afghanistan. He's an intelligence officer. He's never been to the school to become a joint terminal attack controller. That's somebody on the ground that's trained and authorized to release aviation ordnance in close proximity to troops. Has no knowledge on that. I hadn't just gone through that course. I was an instructor out in Yuma, Arizona, is the equivalent of the Air Force's Red Flag or the Navy's Top Gun. I was the super JTAC on the ground. The only guy who'd been trained and had controlled all these weapon systems. So I'm working for this guy. They declare troops in contact. One of our platoons starts getting involved. He just lets the enemy get closer and closer. He delays for 50 minutes. That's 50 minutes. These guys are, so the previous deployment that our battalion was on, neither battalion commander or myself were over there, and this was Afghanistan. But the previous deployment, one of those reconnaissance teams did get compromised. The Taliban overran them. They overran 3 Marines. They captured them, tortured them, shot them in the head, stripped their bodies naked, threw them off a cliff. Little background color. So now we're over there, again in the Helmand province. Battalion commander, intelligence officer, no background in Afghanistan. You'd think an intelligence officer would be somebody that would be passionately understanding the enemy's situation. Maybe he did. I didn't see him for the whole year before digging in intelligence reports on. But he's the guy, delayed 50 minutes, constantly during those 50 minutes asking the lawyer this, that, and the other, worried about the optics on these restrictions. And finally, against my recommendation, I'm requesting, because he delayed, enemies moved from 275 meters down to 34 meters. They're hitting him on multiple flanks. Rocket-propelled grenades, medium machine guns, really taking a pounding to our guys. And now they're at belt buckle distance. I told them, like, now we need to, the Marines they don't have the financial resources as the United States Air Force, so we didn't go for the AC-130 with the howitzer and the Bofors guns. We went with this KC-130. In one of the fuel stations, we put this weapons platform called the Harvest Hawk, and essentially it can launch 4 Griffin missiles, which is essentially, it's a laser-guided javelin, and that is an anti-armor weapon that uses, not to get too technical, I am a nerd about this, uses 4 pounds of high explosives in a shape charge. That's something that uses, instead of shrapnel blasting 3-dimensionally, it uses a blast that, when it impacts armor, is made to go punch a hole that uses overpressure and kills the inside of an armored vehicle by basically causing their innards to implode. So you can use that very non-invasively and very local, and limit the collateral damage. And that's what I was urging him to use, this Griffin missile with only 4 pounds of high explosives that's not blasting shrapnel 3-dimensionally. And that was on a Marine C-130 that had as you well know, a ton of loiter time on station, so it could hang out up there. Where these jets that had these 500-pound bombs is we call technically a GBU 54, which is a precision guided munition. It has be controlled by a laser and or a GPS to deliver it down within a meter of its target. But it's a 500-pound bomb.
Yeah, that's a big bomb.
Yeah, it's blasting 250 pounds surrounded by 250 pounds of shrapnel, three-dimensionally. So if you've ever seen steel ripped and twisted, it's about the size of your hand, or some of this breaks out in the size of your fingers and goes ripping through your body. Just the blast, the high explosive at that proximity going through the soft tissue in your brain, you're not allowed to drop this. It depends actually on the angle of attack, and without getting too weird, if you deliver it at a higher angle other than 69 degrees, so it's almost straight, it's straighter down, more perpendicular to the earth, you can drop it within 130 meters. If not, you have to drop it within 180 meters. These guys were within 34 meters. I also asked them, we had a Marine, or had an armed drone. No, the KC-130, Marine KC-130, had the Griffin missile, the 4-pound HE shape charge. Then we had an armed drone with Hellfires. That's 10 pounds of high explosives, also in a shape charge using overpressure to blast, not shrapnel through them. I said, let's use the drone or the C-130, not the Harriers with the 500-pound bomb. He drops the 500-pound bomb on it 34 meters away from his own guys. Now, we didn't have feed of surveillance, so this is green zone, upper Sangin Valley, Afghanistan, very flat, no contour intervals. I'm assuming, because we have no video feed, that, and we didn't get a report from the Marines that were in troops in contact, they're getting pounded. I'm thinking we're dropping this on troops in the open, that our guys are going to die. They were actually in a canal, thank God, because that's what saved their lives. But our battalion commander nor I knew that. We were dropping this with a perception that we were going to kill our own guys, and it didn't need to be that way. I was urging, use the two smallest methods to engage, and that's what my job as the operations officer is to do, in especially with my background in training, having dropped over 2,000 live ordnance releases. Wow. Prior to that, in training and in multiple close air support workup packages for overseas deployments. So after that, the enemy position that it landed on had been vacated. It had no effect. Our guys were still getting pounded. They still requested aviation support. So the Harriers, these vertical straight takeoff Marines, are just now phasing them out. They checked off station for gas, so they had to, we call bingo, go and get fuel, and they're out of there. So, but the KC-130 and the drone are still there, able to use the two least invasive, best options. What does he do? He fires the even larger ordnance, 2 surface-fired rockets. These are called HIMARS rockets, 675-pound warheads, blasting shrapnel. And he fires them in open sheath formation. So you as a weaponeer understand that when you spread that damage out, instead of a closed sheath, instead of firing them, because you can deliver these within 1 meter of accuracy. So he spreads this out, and you think, that can't be true. Google search Homiak, Homiak, that was the battalion commander, SOFREP, SOFREP. Watch the video that our recon Marines gave to the reporter, Nick Kaufman, on this. You'll see there's one
there's
missile.
Actual video of it. Oh, wow. I didn't know that.
There's video of it. So when I'm talking about this and people read this and it seems like almost too, like this can't be, and then you watch the video. Oh, well, also I say this. This happened, the Marsoc case happened 15 and a half years ago. I've done hundreds and hundreds of interviews. I've sent letters that were sworn with affidavit and polygraph to 88 members of the House and Senate Armed Services Committee, to my Kansas district representative and my Kansas senators. I've sent it when I was on active duty to the Inspector General, I've never had anyone in the military ever dispute a single word. And that's when that second fire mission went and those 2 HIMARS rockets landed. Then the battalion commander, Lieutenant Colonel Homiak, said that platoon commander, that recon platoon commander, is not doing his job. He disapproved any further fires. So once, he basically left them on their own. After that mission, I debriefed the platoon. They finally made it back because they were able to break contact. I figured out what had happened from their perspective. I talked to the battalion commander. I asked him for his guidance on fires. That's when Lieutenant Colonel Homiak told me, face to face, and this is from his mouth, he said, I'm willing to sacrifice the lives of these Marines, and I need to make sure you will too. He didn't just say that to me, Justin. He repeated that a second time as per my polygraph conducted by the late Terrence Victor O'Malley, the former president of the American Polygraph Association. So if the Marine Corps ever thought, even after retirement, that I was lying, I mean, I'm a pensioner. I'm on the Uncle Sam's payroll. That's a false official statement. If they thought I would have been kicked out, I could be brought back on active duty and prosecuted. But they haven't even said a word to this day. They don't dispute anything in this book. Yeah. I wish they would at least address it, because that would show that there is some form of moral courage. And the American taxpayers, especially your listeners, need to understand what I've continually repeated. Let this soak in a little bit. I've said this is the number one line item on our nation's budget for non-discretionary spending, after all the entitlements and everything. So you're not getting a discount on what we're spending in our military. People say, oh, well, it's the lowest bidder for what we buy stuff. It's like, this is the most expensive thing that we pay as taxpayers, and it's not working. If you're cool with the battalion commander, and the guy who said that, Homiak, that's his real name. Look him up. He's still in circulation. He's a full bird colonel now, leading Marines.
Promoted. Yep.
He got promoted, got command. He actually got a Bronze Star for that.
Wow.
I'm not making any of this up.
Travesty.
When you go to chapter 26, you start reading of what happened to all these guys that threw us under the bus and accused us, and they all got promoted.
It's sad.
They went up and up. So that's who's leading and making decisions, and that's who's rewarded even after they get out and they go onto these boards. If that's what you want, America, I mean, we're going to be heading to a war with a superpower. It's inevitable. It's a matter of time. Who do you want? Who do you want leading the sons and daughters of our military of tomorrow? Do you want a guy like Travis Homiak, who says, I'm willing to sacrifice the lives of these Marines? That's what he said. He hasn't disputed it. They sent me to another trial. This is in the book. Read it. Read the book, A Few Bad Men. I went to trial. He didn't dispute a single word. He had my polygraph. The court had my polygraph. On January 2nd, 2019, that Department of the Navy, signed by the General Counsel, Catherine Kussmeyer, the 12-page scathing report, by named he was Lieutenant Colonel then, Homiak, and stated that after they did an intense investigation, they believe he did what he did. They don't dispute. They
don't even care.
What he did was immoral and unjust, but he's still in circulation.
Wow.
So America, at the end of the day, you'll own a house, most Americans, but at the end of your life, you'll pay more in taxes, and most of that money is going to our Department of Defense.
It's a sad
This
reality.
is what you're paying for. You're paying more and getting less. So, like today when I was in the store and I see, oh, this is a bag of almonds, but I'm paying more, and it's a smaller package. This is, different. I know I'm talking apples to airlines, but kind of correlates that you are getting less and you're paying more. Our Department of Defense budget keeps getting bigger and bigger, but you're getting less. Did we win this war? No. Did we win the war in World War II? Yes. We won it in 3.5 years, not 20.
Yep.
And when we left Tokyo Bay, it wasn't in a C-17 with Japanese dangling to their death from the wheel wells like we did over a year ago in Afghanistan when the Afghans were falling to their death. I mean,
It was wild.
we are perceived as weak because our military leaders. So
it is. Well, I got two more things for you. I'll wrap this up for everyone listening. The first is, this will only make sense if you read the book, but when the part where they were grilling basically Major, I don't know how to say his name, is it Ukili?
Ukili
for writing his own medal, we all immediately thought of this meme.
His own fitness report too.
Yeah. Are you in the AMA chat by chance? Can you see in there where everybody's talking?
No. Give me a second, I'll look at it.
Yeah, so you'll stay in this, but if you go in there, so I'll post this meme. I don't know if you've ever seen the Obama giving Obama a medal meme, but we all thought of this meme when we read that. So if you can see that in there, I don't know if you've seen that meme before, but we all thought about that.
No.
It was pretty fun. It's just a kind of internet subculture type thing that goes around when people reward themselves. So we had a good laugh at that. But my final question to you is really, going through all of this, why did you stay in the Marines? Like, I can't fathom your choice to do that, and I'm just curious what your reasoning was.
Well, as I had mentioned in interviews and in the book, my family took a trip. We went to the East Coast and saw several of the American Revolutionary and Civil War battlefields. I did that when I was 10, and some of the park rangers were so incredible and instrumental in making that description of the sacrifices so real. So I didn't know I wanted to be a Marine. As a matter of fact, a lot of those battles that we went to weren't described by Marines. They were more U.S. Army. But I knew I wanted to join the military, and it wasn't until high school. So at 10 years old, that thought was in my head. That root was planted into the soil, got watered a couple times later, and then in high school, this kid, he was kind of a radical. He was saying, hey, if you want to join the military, the Marines is the branch of service, because they have this motto, which is their motto at the time, the first to fight. Yeah, Congress can deploy him for less than 180 days, or the president can deploy him without an act of Congress for 180. I was like, well, sign me up. So we literally down in the recruiter's office. And so it was a passion of mine, and I never had anything bad go on in the Marines. I mean, I just loved it. I'm not saying every day was great. I mean, you have tough days. But up until these things had occurred, I just thought the Marine Corps was great. So I really did believe in our national defense. When I got into Force Reconnaissance, which was the predecessor in the Marine Corps to the Special Operations Command, the Marine Special Operations Command, these were Marines who were so dedicated. And they told me, and I read it in the book, A Few Bad Men, that they told us when I was a young second lieutenant, just commissioned as an officer in the Marines, I became an infantry officer. That was the path at that time to become a Force Recon platoon commander. They said, if you ever go to reconnaissance, don't ever stay long and don't ever go back. It's a career killer. You're infantry officers and you need to be in infantry units. So I left the infantry, went over to Force Recon, and I stayed. And then they sent me to be this instructor at the Marine Corps version Top Gun. It's called the Weapons and Tactics Instructor Course. Mm-hmm. And then I went from there, that instructor duty, back to Force Recon. So I knew I was doing career suicide, but those Marines were so dedicated. And I'm talking what I saw them do overseas when I was stationed in Okinawa, and we're going to conduct this bilateral multinational training all across the Pacific. And you serve besides warriors and these commandos that are completely committed. Oh, yeah. They're just so intense. And I was kind of like Peter Pan. I didn't ever want to see my shadow and just want to be young forever. And like, this is awesome. but it was more than that. It's just like you see these people, like I mentioned, after leaving instructor duty and going back to Force Recon. I've served from '02 to '06 at First Force Recon as a platoon commander, just making these trips back to Iraq, and the level of commitment of these guys. And this is a phenomenal fact. This is the only unit in the Marine Corps. This is the unit at First Force Reconnaissance Company I was serving with at Camp Pendleton, California, that never had someone killed in action since 9/11. No one was killed by enemy action. We had 2 Marines that I served with who were wounded in action, but none killed in action. So, and I say that's a level of commitment. These guys is so kinetic. We'd go over. There were Marines in that unit going over 6 months out of the year to Iraq. We're just going back and forth and back and forth. But you have guys that were so dedicated and committed to that mission. I was just like, and I don't know if I accurately described it in the book or not, but I did. So they offered me duty station right as I was getting promoted to major. They said, hey, you can go train these reservists in Kaneohe Bay, right where they filmed that opening scene to Gilligan's Island. Yeah, they said you could go to Hawaii, on the windward side of Hawaii, and train this reserve force recon unit that works 1 weekend a month, or you can get this naval attaché over in Hanoi, Vietnam, where you kind of wine and dine dignitaries. And I turned those down, and I'm not trying to patronize myself, but I just really didn't want to live with that regret if I'm serving with these guys that would give their lives and we're just going back and forth to war. That was not an option for me. I turned those down. I said no. And so when we got exonerated, I did continue to serve 7 more years. And actually, I went back overseas, went back to combat. Then they sent me to another trial, tried to kick me out. And I could have retired, but then, I went on to serve as a commanding officer at First Fast, which is like the SWAT team for the Marine Corps. And our first was in charge of Europe and Africa, which was all this stuff that was going on with Benghazi. And then I was forced into retirement, due to service limitations at the rank of major at 2014. And it was because, contradictory to the lie that the retired General Joe Dunford, Marine 4-star General, lied to Senators Claire McCaskill, Roy Blunt, James Moran, and Senator Roberts, all 4 senators of Kansas, Missouri, and the late Congressman Walter B. Jones, saying no adverse judicial or administrative action was taken against these Marines. Total lie. Why do Americans allow their generals to lie to our elected officials, or especially to members of the House and Senate Armed Services Committees? This is all in the book. I mean, I didn't even go in. There's so much more. We had to cut from 432 pages. They wanted it as close to 300 pages of actual, besides appendices and everything. Publishers want for marketing purposes to get it sellable. But there's so much more in that book, and I will never do a repeat. Will never. But I will talk about it. It's just so much more that's damning. Again, why is all this happening? Because we're paying for it. We are literally paying for it. Most people will sit on their couch. Even the listeners won't get on the phone tomorrow and spend 5 minutes. It's too important. They got too much. That's why I say I live my life by a calendar. I put it on the calendar. I will make the call. I will spend the time. And guess what? People want to know who to vote for. There's very few things that our Constitution actually obligates that the U.S. government do. And one of them is to provide for the national defense and the general welfare. Very few, but national defense is one of them. So if an elected so-called leader is not going to even have the courtesy to correspond back to their constituents about a matter of national security, you have your vote set out for you. Find somebody else to vote for. And I'm not saying who that person is. I'm not trying to but if that person is not concerned about you and your concern for national defense, that's an easy decision.
Agreed.
So,
Agreed.
But
well, Major Galvin, we really appreciate you joining. And I know this ended up being 2 hours. I said 30 minutes originally, so I could pick your brain for hours longer, but I'll try to respect everyone's time. And I hope, we can communicate more later, get a little more technical and nerd out. For everyone, if you haven't read his book, I'll post it in the chat, A Few Bad Men. It's an incredible read. I highly recommend you read it. And Major Galvin, just again, we are honored with your presence. Thank you so much for joining us. I think a lot of us learned a ton today, and it was a great experience. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Justin, and it's a privilege to be able to share this with your listeners. Hopefully, they're not just concerned; they will be active. And again, I'm not somebody trying to pawn, raise money or anything. But your listeners, this is something that's important to every American. We take action on this.
100%. And we, that's what we're big on here is activism and getting people involved in their community at a local level. So we definitely appreciate that advice, and it's something we try to give and motivate our crew to do daily. So thank you, everyone. I hope everyone enjoys their Sunday night, and we'll see you next Sunday for our AMA with Mad Liberals.